Welcome back to Dead Man Talking. I am your host, Dead by Dalen. As the sun continues to set earlier and earlier, something far scarier than anything we could ever cover on the show approaches us all. Finals. Make sure to get plenty of sleep and eat a good breakfast to avoid the dangers of this deadly disease. Today is an important day, for today is the Dead Man Talking mid-season finale. This will be the last new episode of your favorite Grand Junction-based horror and mystery narration until January. This week, we look back on some of the best stories and moments this podcast and radio show has had to offer. We begin the show just 2 weeks before Halloween, because it is truly the spookiest time of the year, and I am not good at what one might call planning ahead. But we did start off with quite the story. Don't Ever Take Your Eyes Off Your Children This Halloween by Michael Richardson. Dad, just a few more houses, please? Why did I say yes? I blame myself every day, but how could I not? If you saw his face, if you saw those big, beautiful brown eyes staring up at you, I don't see how you could refuse. My son, Daniel, dressed as Captain Jack Sparrow for the second year in a row, pulled and tugged at my hand until I relented. I agreed to just a few more houses, then we go home, okay? I was weak, spurned on by love. We had finished our third block of houses. His pillow sack was almost full of all sorts of candy, a fact I was reminded of every passing minute as I lugged it around on my back. He had one of those small plastic pumpkin carriers for the front doors, and he'd run back to me and dump the contents into the pillowcase. Our system was flawless, a perfect combination of teamwork and strategy meant to produce maximum amounts of candy. Those answering the door would see an adorable Jack Sparrow with an empty bucket, and most of them would add some extra candy bars or gum packets to accommodate the poor pirate. So he didn't need more candy. He was just enjoying the night. An unseasonably warm October after so many years of miserably cold Halloween nights. I couldn't say no. Children only have so many years of trick-or-treating in them, and I wanted to make him the most of each one. We walked down an alleyway to the next block, the last street before the country fields took over. The first house was lit up with orange and white lights, fake spiderwebs draped over their hedges. He practically sprinted up to the door, not noticing the fake body sitting on the chair. At least, I thought it was fake. It started to move. I tried to yell and warn Daniel, but the body on the chair already grabbed my son's arm, emitting a howling growl at the same time. Daniel, Captain Daniel, was unfazed. He even started to laugh. I was so proud of him in that moment. After thanking the woman at the door and wishing her a happy Halloween, he sprinted back to me, excitedly dumping the contents of his conquest into the bulging pillow sack. Dad, did you see me? I wasn't scared at all. Buddy, you are a champ. If that was me, a little bit of pee would have come out. Bet on it. We shared a laugh together, and he threw his arms around me. It would be the last time either of us would laugh. I looked down at his eyeliner-streaked face, his beautifully crafted hand-sewn pirate hat, courtesy of the missus, and, to my everlasting shame, I said the words that haunt me every day. Okay, little captain, one more house. There was only 3 more on the street. The 2 beside the house we had just gone to were dark and had no decorations on them. Every child and parent knows this as the universal sign of don't bother coming to my house for candy. So we skipped those 2 and ended up at the house at the end of the road. To his credit, Daniel noticed that it also didn't have any decorations, but the front porch light was on. He looked at me, silently asking for my approval. I didn't get a sense that anything was particularly wrong or off about the house. Even though it didn't have any of the lights or spiderwebs or fake bodies the other houses had, the outside light was on and we could both see a red and white candy-striped bucket on the front porch. There was also a note above the bucket, and I could already guess what it instructed that you take a few pieces of candy and be on your way. But I was always cautious, ever wary. I told him to stay on the sidewalk, and I walked up to the front porch. I picked up the note. It read, "If no one should answer when you ring the bell, please take a candy, and I wish you well." There were no windows that I could subtly peer into, but the house on the outside was perfectly presentable. The porch was clean, the lawn crisply cut, and clearly maintained. I peered inside the bucket and my eyes lit up. Even as an adult, I knew that full-size chocolate bars were rare. But there they were. Snickers, Mars, O. Henry, all of the classics in full-sized glory. I was so excited for Daniel. I turned around and went back to the sidewalk where he was practically brimming with energy. Even after a long night like this one, he was raring to go. I put on my best pirate voice. "All right, Captain. The note says to knock on the door, and if no one answers, you can take one of the treats from the bucket. Just one, though, okay? Make it fair for the other children." "Aye, aye, me matey," he said back in his best pirate voice. We gave each other a fist pump. He walked up the pathway to the front door. I made sure to watch him the whole way. It could be another setup, some clever house owners putting together an elaborate ruse to get the children's guard down before they reveal the big scare. My phone vibrated once in my pocket. No doubt it was a text message from my wife. I watched as my son knocked on the door and patiently waited. We agreed before the night began that if nobody answered within 10 seconds, then it was time to move on. I remember every detail of those next 10 seconds. 1, I took my phone out of my pocket, still keeping an eye on Daniel. 2, I entered the code in without looking at the phone, unlocking the screen. 3, Daniel was still waiting at the door. 4, through muscle memory, I brought up the new messages screen, still not taking my eyes off of my son. 5, he began to turn around. 6, he started to head towards the bucket left on the front porch. 7, he smiled at me. 8, I glanced down at my phone. Sent. "You and the captain okay?" 9, reply, "On our way home." 10, Daniel was gone. I didn't register it at first. I figured he was hiding behind something. "Daniel!" I called out. "Daniel!" There was no reply. I ran up to the porch, but I found nothing. No clue as to where he had gone. There was no way he could have ran around the house, not in the span of 1 to 2 seconds. No way. I looked up and down the street, but there was no one. No parents, no kids, nobody. Did someone open the door? Was he inside? I started to pound furiously on the front door, screaming my son's name. I was screaming at the top of my lungs as I tugged at the door handle, trying to get it open. I must have screamed loud enough because the woman whose house Daniel was so brave at opened her door and yelled after me. "Is everything all right?" "No. Have you seen my son? The little boy dressed as a captain." "Oh my goodness, no, I haven't. Should I call someone?" Call someone? His cell phone. I smacked myself in the forehead. I forgot he had one on him. I grabbed the phone out of my pocket and dialed his number. It went straight to voicemail. I almost threw the phone right then and there, but I tried to calm myself down, tried to think back. But all I could picture was someone, something, opening the door, grabbing my son, and covering his mouth before he could scream for me. I dialed 911. I didn't care if we found him later, if he was playing some trick on me. I just wanted him back. I told the neighbor to grab a flashlight and help me look for him. When the cops arrived, the neighbor and I had been looking all around the house, trying to find a way in. I was about to break a window when I heard the sirens. Those wailing sirens echoing in the distance. I took such comfort in them. I just knew in my heart that as soon as they got here, my son would pop out of somewhere, tell me it was all a big joke. I wouldn't scold him, I wouldn't yell at him. I would just hug and squeeze and hold on to him until he left for college. I told the cops everything, down to the exact detail as I remember it. They also pounded on the door. But when they saw my frantic behavior, the impatience riddling my body, they went ahead and broke the door in. They told me to stay behind, let them clear the house. I wanted to protest, to scream at them, to tell them nothing could keep me away. But when they drew their guns and yelled into the house, I knew they were taking this seriously. 5 of the longest minutes of my life passed by. I don't know when she did it, but at one point I looked down and the neighbor was holding my hand. She had children of her own. She knew what was happening, what could be happening. When the 2 cops came out of the house, the look on their faces said it all. I almost broke down there on the street, but I had to hold on a little longer. I tore into the house, past the outstretched arms of the officers, and started yelling for my son, bursting in and out of each room with ferocious intent. It wasn't until I went up the stairs into what was once a bedroom that I realized no one was living in this house. No one had been living in this house for years. I ran down the stairs, almost knocking the officers down as I ran up to the woman, the helpful neighbor. I grabbed her and started yelling, "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you tell me no one was living here?" She started to stammer, taken aback by my sudden turn, my aggression towards her. I didn't know. I've only lived on the street for a few months. I never saw anyone come in or out, but that could be for 100 different reasons. I'm sorry. I didn't know. I stood there, on the street, breathing heavily, holding onto the shoulders of a woman I only met a few minutes before. The officers placed their hands on my arms, and I released her. I looked back at the house, that 2-story monstrosity bathed in darkness, and I knew it. However impossible it was, I knew right there and then. Daniel wasn't coming back. Things for me were dark, really dark, for many months afterwards. I don't really remember all of the police searches, the news bulletins, the press conferences. I ignored the pitied looks of my friends, the suspicious glares of my neighbors. My wife and I, despite everything, remained strong together. Every night we told each other, no body, no death. In our hearts, Daniel was alive. The initial investigation of the house amounted to almost nothing. The previous owner had declared bankruptcy and abandoned the house. The bank hadn't been able to sell it to anyone, so it sat there collecting dust. No one could account for the maintained lawn out front, and the police never found any bucket full of chocolate bars or any note. I don't care what they say. I know what I saw. I know there were some on the police force that suspected me. I went through rigorous interrogations, but they came up with nothing, as I knew they would. I didn't blame them. If I had been in their position, I would have suspected me as well. After 3 months, all things concerning Daniel dissipated, except for in our household. We still put out flyers all over the surrounding neighborhoods every week. We still kept up to date with social media, pleading anybody and everybody to keep an eye out for our boy. I drained my accounts, hiring private detectives to look into the house, the neighborhood, anything that I thought could help. They all came up with nothing. No clues, no traces. Daniel had simply vanished. Every night I had the same nightmare. Someone knocks on the door to our house and I race down, hoping against all hope that it's Daniel. And every time I open the door, it is Daniel. And he's standing there in his Captain Jack uniform and his pumpkin candy carrier. I scream out in joy and grab a hold of him, except his flesh starts to melt and sift through my fingers. His body turns into sand, and suddenly, my son is a pile of dust and dirt on the carpet. Then I wake up. 2 weeks ago, I was on the couch in the afternoon staring at the ceiling when I heard a knock on the door. I got up slowly, thinking it was a reporter coming to do a follow-up or some punk kid claiming to have seen my son, something that had happened all too often. I opened the door and nearly screamed. Not in joy, but in sheer terror. My son was standing there. Daniel. My wife came barreling down the stairs, and she screamed as well, but hers was all happiness. She pushed me out of the way and took Daniel up in her arms. I couldn't move. I kept waiting for his body to turn into mush, his ashes spilling through my wife's fingers. I kept waiting to wake up in my bed, sweating and crying. didn't happen. Against every single odd in the book, Daniel had been returned. Through all the crying and hugging and kissing, Daniel didn't say a word. He was just there. No expression on his face, nothing registering in his eyes. We put it down to shock. Clearly something had happened to him. As each day passed, not a single doctor or therapist or police officer could find anything physically wrong with him. Everything should be in working order, said one particularly pompous doctor after examining Daniel. I can't tell you where your son was or what happened to him, but whatever happened, nothing is wrong with him on the outside. Nothing was wrong with him on the outside? I nearly knocked out that smiling white coat right there and then. But I was so elated to have Daniel back that I shrugged it off, ignored it. Nothing mattered anymore. Daniel was home. Later that night, I was sitting at the dinner table after having tucked Daniel in when I came to the sudden realization that I wasn't exactly happy. I should have been. I should have been screaming over the rooftops with complete joy in my heart. But something was wrong. Daniel wasn't Daniel anymore. That happy, brave boy had come back different. I tried to think about why. Obviously, it had something to do with where he had been, what had happened to him, but there was something else, something nagging at the back of my neck. Then, with a cold, sinking feeling, I remembered. Daniel had said something when I tucked him in. He had whispered, "I like it here." I didn't register it at the time, but sitting at the table, I didn't like it. What did that mean? I ran up the stairs and opened his door. He was sleeping just as he should have been. I almost laughed out loud. What was wrong with me? My son was home. That's all that mattered. A few nights ago, I woke up in the middle of the night to see Daniel standing in the doorway. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there. I looked over to my wife, but she was sleeping. I turned back to Daniel. "Hey there, Captain. Are you okay?" He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at me and smiled. And for a second, my blood turned cold. My flesh raised. That smile wasn't my son. Then he whispered something, but I couldn't hear it. "What was that?" I asked him. Then he sprinted towards me, so fast, so quick, and he yelled, "I like it here." Then he ran back out of our room and into his, slamming his door. My wife slept through the whole thing. Last night was the turning point. I was just about to lock the front door for the evening when my wife started screaming. And I mean screaming. I was convinced in the few seconds it took me to bound up the stairs that someone was killing her. In a way, I was right. I burst through the bedroom door to find Daniel standing over my wife with an axe. He had that dead smile on his face again. The axe was raised above his head when I tackled him. He started to scream, and I started to cry. He just kept repeating the same thing over and over again. "You'll like it there. You'll like it there. You'll like it there." Now, I'm lost. I don't know what to do, who to turn to. And as Halloween approaches, I think I have to go back. Back to the house where it all began. I'm going to take Daniel. Maybe he can show me where he wants us to go. I was so young, so naive, so full of joy. With the idea of making the stories follow a theme each week, I began thinking in the darkness of my office, until I realized that the darkness itself was the perfect next step. The following week, our frightening escapades centered around the monsters that appear in the dark. It all started after moving into my new house. Yeah, that's pretty cliche, believe me, I know. But it's what happened. I never experienced anything supernatural before, and though interested, I never really expected anything to happen to me. I was able to rent the house for pretty cheap. I didn't think anything of it because it was old and not in the best of neighborhoods, so I guessed I just got a good deal. After moving everything in, things were fine for a while. I don't remember exactly when it started because it seemed so minor at the time. I'd leave a light on in the kitchen or the bathroom and come back to find it off. Honestly, I thought I was just forgetting that I turned them off already when I came back. After a while, I began to wonder and started leaving a couple lights on purpose. Sometimes nothing would happen. Sometimes I'd come back to find the lights turned off. By now, I figured out that something was off. I wasn't really scared, but just confused. I thought maybe something was wrong with the electronics. I started leaving lights on a bit more often because I thought I might be able to get some sign of why they would randomly shut off. That's when it started to take another turn. The first real time I remember something crazy happening was when I left the kitchen and living room light on while I was asleep. I woke up to a deep, rumbling growl coming from the kitchen. Now, from the bedroom, you can see down the hall to the living room, and that room is connected to the kitchen. I remember waking up and thinking that there was an animal or something in my house. I looked down the hall towards the living room to see the light darken. Somebody had flicked off the light from the kitchen. Another low growl came, this time from the living room, and I nearly screamed as I saw something bolt across the length of the hall opening, and then the living room light went out. I couldn't tell exactly what it was, though. It just seemed like a black shadow or something. It didn't really matter. I was scared. I bolted from my bed and threw on the bedroom light, expecting something to be in this room and getting ready to come after me. Nothing. There wasn't anything in the room. I let out a low breath, and then I slowly moved down the hall into the living room. Once I got to the end, I practically ran to throw on the light switch there. Again, nothing. Kitchen next, and once again, nothing. I was starting to think I dreamed all of it before I went to turn off the kitchen light and stopped. Now, I was a grown man, but here, I was terrified to turn off that switch. And I'll admit it, I slept with all the lights on that night. That was a mistake. When I woke up the next morning, all the lights were off once again. I went to push myself out of bed and winced as my body felt sore. I pulled the sheets off to see long red marks running down along my legs and arms. It looked like something scratched me in the night. That terrified me, but not nearly so much as what I saw around the house. Every light I left on was smashed. Every light bulb that was on last night was broken. Every lamp knocked over and smashed in. My breath caught in my throat as I looked around. Something was messed up here, and something tried to, do something to me. I called in for work that day and went to immediately replace all the lights. I didn't know what to do then. I thought about leaving, and I know this probably sounds stupid, but this was my home. It was my first time away from my family, and this was my home. I couldn't give it up. So, I stayed. Even as it got worse. Even though I was beginning to become terrified of the dark, I couldn't really sleep with the light on me at night in the bedroom. I'd leave other lights on though, like in the hall or the living room, giving myself enough to see pretty well in my darker room. And almost every night, I'd wake up in the middle of the night to hear something growling and prowling around the living room, and then the lights would shut off. I didn't want to go look. I was terrified at the thought of being in the same room with whatever was in there. So I curled up in bed and prayed it never came in. One night, after this went on for a while, I had it. I bought a gun and turned on every light in the house. Then, I sat down in the middle of the living room with my gun in my lap and a baseball bat sitting next to me. I waited. There was nothing at first for a long time. At around 2 a.m, I began to hear it. Oddly, it was behind me. I turned and peeked towards the hall to my bedroom and could hear that familiar growl. I swallowed and held my gun in one hand and the bat in the other, and slowly began to step around to get a better view of my bedroom from the living room. As I began to get a view of my bed, I heard a loud thump, followed by an inhuman roar. I, being the brave man I was, jumped back and away from the hallway. I wanted to end this all, but dear God, I didn't want to deal with that thing. I could hear tearing and smashing, and I don't know how I caught it, but I did manage to hear an audible click, and then nothing. Slowly, I went back to peek down the hall, and the light was off once again. A deep breath, and I ventured forth, my weapons ready. When I came to my bedroom and flicked the light back on, I gasped. My bed was ravaged, torn completely apart. It was like some animal had jumped into it and just ripped it to shreds. I stepped forward to look at what was left of my bed and just stood in shock for who knows how long. It wasn't until I heard the sound of a familiar growl that I turned around. Standing near my door, right at the light switch, was when I finally saw it. It was a man. A white and rotting man with a mangled body that looked like he had once been a dog's chew toy staring at me. I was too in shock to even raise my weapons. He stared at me for just a moment and then flicked off the light. I screamed. I'm not even ashamed to admit it. I screamed and bolted. I didn't care if that was where that man had been standing. I ran right past where I had seen him, swinging my bat like a madman. I nearly put a hole in the hallway as I ran into the safe light of the hall. I turned to look back then, just in time to see him once again near the hall's light switch. He turned that one off too. By then, I didn't want to fight. I wanted to be safe. I burst past the living room and into the brightness of my kitchen. I heard the sound of growling and scratching nearly all around me then, and I knew he was coming back. I looked back once again to see that mangled and rotten corpse of a man turn off another light with a broken finger and plunge me into terrifying darkness. I broke for the living room. This was going to be my final stand. I'd have to fight here. I drew close to the standing lamp that was my last line of defense. It hated the dark, so I'd stay right here, next to this comforting standing lamp. I waited for it to turn off, but it never did. I looked around and quiet. Nothing but quiet. I turned then to look at the saving grace of a lamp that refused to yield. I started to find myself laughing, a crazy but alive laugh, and I thought I'd finally be okay. I stepped closer, and I swear I almost hugged that lamp. Until I saw it. I heard the growl first coming not from behind me, but in front. From that lamp, my eyes widened and I stared as the light from that lamp intensified. I stumbled back and I don't know what happened, but I think I tripped on something. I just know I found myself flat on my back staring up at that bright, intense light. It wasn't comforting any longer, just hot and heavy and bright. I thought it was going to burn me away, and then it came. I don't have words to describe what poured from that lamp's light. It was hideous, twisted, and filled with rage. I know I'll never forget those eyes, though. Bright, hot, and white, two glowing circles of pure malice. It hated me. It hated everything about me. And not just me, it hated all of us, every human being. But it was stuck here, and it would lash out at what it could. I don't know how I knew this, but I just knew. It lunged for me, and I prepared myself for a painful death. The light went out. Once again came darkness. Sweet, quiet, relaxing darkness. I stayed on the ground for a long moment, letting my eyes adjust as I kept my gaze fixated on where my standing lamp was. As the seconds passed, I could start to make him out. That mangled man standing by the lamp, one torn hand upon the switch as he looked down on me. I understood then. I understood what it all meant. Everything that happened. The man pulled his hand away from it and then pointed a mangled finger toward it before, very clearly, shaking his head from side to side. All I could find myself doing was nodding. He wasn't the one trying to harm me. All this time, all those instances, he was trying to protect me. That creature could only come in the light, and this mangled man had been trying to keep me safe. He didn't want someone else to repeat his mistakes. I moved out the very next day and never looked back. Whatever it was confined to that house, and, so far, nothing has come at me from another light source. However, that thing will always stick with me in my mind. Every night, in my new apartment, I made a habit of wandering around the house, making sure every light is off, every curtain is closed, and made sure to plunge myself in quiet, comforting, and safe pitch darkness.
I can't believe he found them.
He seems sorry.
We very clearly told him not to look up there.
I'm honestly impressed that he was able to do it.
Right? What, did he balance on that big chair?
Yeah, I mean, I guess he'll just know what his gifts are this year.
I really thought we had hidden them well.
If they can find their presents, they can find a gun.
911, what is your emergency?
Every day, 8 kids and teens are unintentionally killed or injured by loaded and unlocked guns. Learn how to make your home safer at endfamilyfire.org. Brought to you by the Ad Council and End Family Fire.
A few weeks later, Halloween was upon us. At the same time, we here in Grand Junction were getting our first taste of snow. A perfectly apt time to get some colder, scary stories in. Wouldn't you agree? Growing up, my parents told me never to go into the basement. It is kind of interesting now that I think back on it. I was an obedient kid and never did anything that my parents told me not to. But I also never once questioned, until very recently, why I wasn't allowed to go down those stairs. Our house was huge. My dad worked in finance, but grew up a country boy before college. So, as soon as we had the chance, he moved us out into isolation. Even though this made his commute over an hour into town, I loved it. Especially when I was younger, because we had lots of animals on our property. Some wild and some actually owned by my parents. My mom would stay home and take care of the chickens and the geese while I watched and played with them. My mom would always tell me not to get too close with the animals because we would sell some of them from time to time, and she didn't want my feelings to get hurt. I did my best to follow her instructions, but I have to admit, there were definitely some animals I missed when they got sold off. I spent many evenings after the long bus ride home from school, sitting out back with the animals, watching the sun go down over the wide open fields. It was more peaceful than words could describe. But of anywhere on the acres and acres of property, the only place I wasn't allowed to be was that basement. I once tried to walk down with my mom when she went downstairs to do the laundry. I offered to hold the basket of dirty clothes for her as she went down the steps, thinking that she would definitely appreciate the help. But I was terribly wrong. As soon as my foot hit that top step behind her, and before I could squeak out my offer to assist her, she turned around and pushed me back using the laundry basket. Not a hard push, but enough of one to force me back through the door and into the kitchen. "What have I told you?" she said to me. "What have I said about coming down here?" I apologized and hung my head, feeling like a bad kid. She could sense that and patted me on the head. "It's okay," she said. "Just don't do that again. You need to stay up here. Why don't you go see if any of the chickens have laid eggs? I forgot to go out this morning and I would love the help." I smiled and agreed to do it, walking out the back kitchen door towards the coop, my mom closing the basement door behind her before I even made it outside. The weather was terrible a few winters ago. We were pummeled by the snow and, unfortunately, a lot of the animals died on the farm. Don't get me wrong, we were okay and everything. Again, farming was more of a hobby than a means of income or survival. But I was pretty upset by the animals no longer being there. For some reason, my parents got jittery and seemed to be more and more out of character the longer we were forced to be in the house. We had plenty of food and our power hadn't gone out, so I couldn't figure out what it was that they were freaking out over, besides being stuck and not being able to go outside. There was a knock at the door a week or two into the snowstorm, and I remember how strange it was that we would have a visitor. We never had visitors. We were pretty far out into the sticks and people didn't want to swing by or anything, especially without letting us know first. My dad answered the door and there was a young man, lacking all color and covered head to toe in white, thick snow. He thanked my father graciously for opening the door and explained his situation. His car had broken down about 6 or 7 miles up the road and he didn't know where to go. He didn't have a cell phone and he was traveling across the country, so he didn't know who he would have contacted anyway. My father invited him in, and all of a sudden, that jittery sense about my parents started to float away. They seemed more calm now that this stranger was in the house, and it was such a peculiar situation that I just had to sit back and watch. I listened to this man tell us that he didn't have any family living except a sister that he hadn't spoken to in years, and that he was on his way to Boston to start fresh. He said that his mother had passed away only a few months prior and pulled out a tiny gold locket on a chain. He told us that it belonged to her and that it was the only thing that he had left of her. I smiled and nodded at him, still not saying a word. After he spoke for a few minutes, my parents realized that the snow covering his clothing was melting and that everything he had on was soaked. My mother looked at my father and said to the man, "Would you like to change? You and my husband seem to be about the same size. You could borrow some of his clothing for now." My father nodded along. The stranger stood and shook my father's hand, thanking him over and over again while my mom led him towards the kitchen. "Our laundry room is right this way. I'm sure we can find you something." She opened the basement door and gestured the man towards it. Without hesitation, he started down the wooden steps. My father came to me and told me to go upstairs and get ready for dinner. I said okay and walked up the large staircase, not thinking twice about the request. When I came downstairs, my mom and dad were setting the table. I asked if the stranger would be joining us, but without even looking up at me, they said that he had left. I didn't know what to say to that because he had almost frozen to death just getting to the house, and the closest town wasn't for miles and miles. There was no way he would make it back. My parents told me to have a seat and dinner went along like nothing happened. But I finally got curious. This man couldn't have just disappeared into thin air. I had to know what was going on in the basement. I had to know if he ever came back up. I was young, but not stupid. I knew that something was wrong. That night, after my parents had gone to bed, I grabbed the flashlight from my drawer and started down the stairs towards the kitchen. The floors creaked, so I had to really take my time, making sure I didn't wake up my parents in the process. When I finally touched the tile of the kitchen, a small wave of relief came over me, and I took a break to steady my breathing, seeing as how I had been holding my breath as I moved across the hardwood. I finally reached out to the knob on the basement door, checked around me one last time, and opened the door with a creak. I placed my foot on the step, which felt much older than the stairs. The air as I head down smelled sweet, but a foul kind of sweet. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I came down to the concrete floor and listened the best I could. Silence. Nothing. I flashed the light around to see a washer and dryer, just as I had expected, and some boxes of what I remembered to be old clothes and such, but nothing really out of the ordinary. I was turning to head back up the stairs, now feeling silly and actually pretty sour with myself for not listening to my parents, when something shiny caught my eye. I turned the flashlight on it and walked over to where it lay on the floor. It was the golden locket the stranger had showed us from his mother. I picked it up and leaned myself against the wall to examine it further when the wall started to move with my shifting weight. I jumped back, frightened, and shined my flashlight on the wall, realizing that it was, in fact, fake. Being the curious kid I was, and still clutching the locket, I moved the wooden portion of the wall out of the way, revealing a shallow hole. What I saw in there is something that has changed my life forever.
Inside the hole sat a creature. This thing looked like a human, like a boy, but quite different. His limbs were much longer than a regular person, widely disproportionate from his body. At the end of each arm were bony fingers with sharp claws that this thing curled over and over again by its face. Its eyes were pitch black with no pupils. It was a hairless beast, and its ears were simply torn holes in the sides of its head. The mouth stretched across its face into a large, sharp-toothed grin. It had no clothing besides a small cloth covering its lower abdomen. Around its neck was a thick chain attached to the concrete wall. It stared at me, smearing what looked like blood across its wrinkled face, smiling. My foot hit something and I looked down briefly, trying to not take my eyes off of this beast or creature or whatever it was. A hand. Too afraid to scream, I turned and started running towards the stairs. I only took about 3 or 4 steps before crashing into my parents, who stood over me with their arms crossed, shaking their heads. My dad put his arm around my shoulder and led me up the stairs into the living room while my mom covered up the hole. The chickens and animals that I missed were never really sold. My dad didn't grow up on a farm or like living in isolation, but rather felt as though we had to. We had no neighbors for a reason. It was planned that way. Our whole lives up to this point, even now, years later, has revolved around my older brother in the basement and keeping him fed.
When the proverbial snow melted, we were left with the storyline taking place woven in between the horror and mystery. A story about death, about loss, about change. A story about a radio host, about a university, and about Jerry.
Tragedy has struck the Grand Valley area as the bodies of 2 college students have been found dead at the KMSA radio station on Mesa State College's main campus.
It says 2 people. I've been alone in this booth for so long. When was the last time I went home? Well, in any case, let's continue with tonight's festivities. And now, 2-sentence horror stories. I was never a fan of eating while on an airplane, but we'd crashed 5 days ago and I was starving, so I started on my left leg. I was really scared of spending Halloween alone this year, but as I listened to the sobs from the trick-or-treaters in my basement, I smiled at the knowledge that my fears were unfounded. The water outside was peaceful. That's only because I couldn't get the car window to break. No kids came for Halloween tonight. I guess that means the bear traps worked. My phone call with my mom was interrupted by a knock on the door. Mouthing me to hang up was my mom. It took 5 minutes and a screwdriver, but the cap finally came loose with a satisfying pop. Now, for the other knee. I can hear 1 year into the future. Today, the noise stopped. He tortured me for over an hour, adding to my pain little by little, and then he did the one thing I thought one friend could never do to another. Uno. I forgot to grab something. I'll be right back, said Mom. As she rounded the corner, out of sight, the cashier began ringing up our groceries. Oh my God. Oh.
What's going on?
Oh, how long have you been here?
I don't know. I just came to just a little while ago.
Oh my God.
What's happening?
Oh, I'm doing my show right now.
Show?
I'm reading scary stories. Yeah, it's Halloween. You know, we're doing like a special.
Halloween?
Yeah. Wait,
What do you mean Halloween?
Who are you again? What's your name?
I don't remember at all. What's happening?
Wait, it's Jerry, right? Yeah, no, you're the guy that gave me the Dead by Dalen name. That's right.
Oh, yeah, that's right. I think.
What happened?
Look, it's kind of hard to explain. Like, I figured I'm so funny all the time outside of the radio station. I figured I'd try and do something serious when I got here, if that makes sense.
No, I get your show. It's just something's not adding up.
Yeah, you're telling me. I saw like a radio thing the other day, and it was talking about the station, but I don't know. I'm just trying to figure it out.
Wait, you said it's Halloween?
Yeah, it's Halloween. You know, October 31st, spooky time.
That doesn't make sense.
What do you mean?
The last thing I remember, we were in September.
What do you mean? It was. Wait. Well, thank you, Jerry. We really appreciate you coming down. Ladies and gentlemen, I need to figure out what's going on. Here's some music to keep you company.
I've been watching you. I've been watching you. Just come to
When I was little, I didn't talk for a long time. I was sensitive to lights and sounds, so I built secret hiding places where they couldn't get in. Sometimes I do the same things over and over, until one day I found out I had autism. My family got me help. Slowly, I learned how to live with it better.
Early intervention can make a lifetime of difference. Learn the signs at autismspeaks.org/signs. Brought to you by Autism Speaks and the Ad Council.
With Halloween well behind us, I wanted to shift the course of the stories more away from horror to mystery. A nice transition piece was already in play in the form of a series started on Halloween night. This story focused on a cabin in Colorado with strange happenings surrounding it. Each week, we have read one chapter. If you've missed any chapters, all of these podcasts can be found on YouTube or at Dolan.com/deadmantalking. More on that at the end. To finish off tonight's show, we'll continue on that tradition. My Romantic Cabin Getaway, Chapter 4, by Felix Blackwell. Over the weekend, my fiancée and I stayed in her parents' cabin up in Pikes Peak, Colorado. I made a post about the disturbing events that transpired over the course of a few nights. Many people have messaged me for an update, but I stopped responding because things have gotten worse since we returned home to California. I feel it's time I say what's going on here. I'm sorry that this is long, but I want to document everything. Faye and I flew back from Colorado on Wednesday afternoon. She slept the entire flight, despite the noise, which amazed me. I can't sleep on planes because I'm absolutely terrified of flying. I'd rather stay another night in that cabin. When we got home, I ordered a pizza and she wolfed it down. Her appetite has returned in full force, which is great news. I mentioned this in my original post, but Faye has an undiagnosed sleep disorder. She has pronounced night terrors, sleep talking, and occasional sleepwalking. This disorder lies dormant 90% of the time, but it tends to flare up when she's under a lot of stress. If we're moving, if she's changing jobs, or if a relative dies, I can expect a night of horrifying talking and odd behavior. Needless to say, our experiences at the cabin have set Faye on edge. Although she's in high spirits, she's still afraid at night. I am too. That night, after pizza, she fell asleep on the couch while we watched Wedding Crashers. At around 10 p.m., the movie ended, and I turned the TV off. As I brought our plates to the kitchen, I passed by a stairwell and heard a faint noise from upstairs that sounded like a man sighing. I shrugged it off and woke Faye up. We brushed our teeth and went to bed. Faye talked in her sleep a lot that night, and it started at about 1 a.m. I woke up to her calling out, "What did you do?" and "Do you need help?" and laughing. This isn't really unusual for her. She babbled occasionally, said a few funny things, etc. I woke up again around 4 and heard her talking. But this time, she was doing something she's never done before. We've been together for almost 5 years, and not once has she ever whispered in her sleep. But now, she was whispering with her back turned to me. For a second, I thought someone was lying on the floor at her edge of the bed, talking to her. This disturbed me, so I sat up and leaned over her, trying to listen in the dark. The only thing I hear her say discernibly was, "Shh." I asked her, "Faye, what are you talking about?" And she didn't respond. I said, "Who were you talking to?" And she replied, "Don't," and nudged me. Another unusual thing happened. At about 5:45 a.m., I woke up to Faye getting back into bed. She hurried into the bedroom from the hall and got back into bed quickly, making zero attempts not to wake me. First of all, Faye does not get up. Ever. she sleeps like a dead horse, and even if she went to the bathroom in the middle of the night, which she never does, the bathroom is not down the hall. It's in our bedroom. When I asked her what she was doing the next morning, she claimed to have no memory of it. I spent all day Thursday thinking about why Faye was still acting weird. I was the one who found the dream catcher and got close to it. I was the one who interacted with the voices at the cabin. And then I remembered something. On our last night in Colorado, at her parents' house, Faye got back into bed at around the same time, 5:45 a.m. I barely remembered because I was half asleep, but the image returned to my head. She'd been getting up really early for a few days. So last night, I set my phone's alarm to vibrate, and I put the time to 4:45 a.m. In the middle of the night, Faye started talking again. This time, she was doing the same thing she did at the cabin, changing her voice to sound like someone else. In 5 years that she's sleep-talked a bunch, but has never whispered or changed her voice until recently. She said a few things which I tried to commit to memory. La, 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 sha, followed by down or tail, over and over. He's still in the trees. Where were you? I looked for you. And, ooh, it's time. About the same time, I heard a noise outside, which sounded like an old man grumbling to himself about something. We live in NorCal in a really woodsy town, so when you look out your bedroom window, there are tons of trees across the street. It was very dark, but I'm fairly certain I saw a man walking behind the first line of trees. He was too far away to be the one grumbling, but it is very unusual to see anyone over there this time of night. In fact, I have never seen anyone there at night, ever. Looking outside required me to open the curtains, which lit up our room with moonlight. When I looked back at the bed, Faye was lying there with her neck craned towards me, her eyes crazy wide and fixed on me, and her mouth was open. She issued this really frightening, gurgly, drawn-out groan and flicked her tongue around. It looked like an epileptic fit in slow motion. Faye has definitely opened her eyes in her sleep, but never like this. She looked like a murderer. I got so scared and called her name really loud and woke her up. She was confused and asked me why I was at the window. I lied and said I was just closing it because it was cold. I didn't want her to know that I'd heard a voice. We talked a bit, but I'll skip that because this is already getting long. My alarm woke me up at 4:45 a.m., and I laid there awake, waiting for Faye to get up like she had been the past few nights. She breathes very rhythmically when she's asleep, so I can always tell how deep she's under. At around 5:20, she sat straight up, swung her legs out of the bed, and tiptoed down the hall. I followed behind. And when I say that my fiancé tiptoed, I don't mean like a child on Christmas Eve. This was robotic, alien, inhuman. She moved like a drug-addicted ballerina zombie down the hall and stopped at the stairwell. Her breathing never changed. I just stood there in our bedroom, poking my head out into the dark hall. Faye looked down the stairs, still standing rigidly on the balls of her feet, swaying to and fro slightly. She did some weird things. She touched her face slowly for several minutes, touched the banister, touched the wall, flicked the light on and off a few times, all the while maintaining her perfectly regular coma breathing. Then she reached an arm out in the motion of a bicep curl, stretching her fingers and wiggling them, then curling them, her hand and her arm back up to her face. I watched her do this motion for about 4 minutes. It looked like she was testing the limb, as if she's never used it before. But then I realized she was actually communicating with someone on the first floor of the house. She was making a come hither motion. With full confidence that Faye was sleepwalking, I walked into the hall and leaned over the half wall that overlooks the living room. It was totally dark down there. I couldn't see anything but the clock on the cable box. Faye stood there waving, smiling, making gestures, and then touching her face and pulling gently on her hair. I carefully ushered her back to bed and talked to her softly, trying not to actually wake her. She didn't resist, she never does, and went back to sleep without another word. I have zero clue what is going on here. I told her this morning what she did, and now we have a doctor's appointment for her at 3 p.m. today. What a cliffhanger. Tune back in when we return in January to find out what happens next. Thank you, everyone, so much for listening to Dead Man Talking. I have been your host, Dead by Dalen. For more information on this show and others through 91.3 FM, go to www.kmsa913fm.com. And for more info on this show in particular, including music used and links to all the original stories, go to www.Doolan.com/deadmantalking. That's www.dewlan.com/deadmantalking. Thank you so much for tuning in to the first half of the first season of this show. We'll see you back in January for more frightful fun. Have a safe and happy holiday season, everyone. And, as always, sweet dreams.